All right, looks like we are live. Folks. Welcome, everyone. While we're waiting to give people time to arrive and get linked in, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I know myself, I am normally in Michigan, but tonight I'm joining you all from Kentucky, the bluegrass state. So share with me where you all are joining us from. Panelists, you feel free to chime in too. Where y'all at? Where are we all talking from?
Sunny Los Angeles.
Oh yeah, we saw that beautiful. Can y'all see her backdrop? Isn't it gorgeous? It's so bright and lively. If you're feeling down throughout any part of this experience tonight, just look out her window. It helps. It definitely helped me when I first saw it. What about anybody else? Anybody else? Where y'all at?
Yeah, I'm in Harlem, New York.
Ooh, now that's just energy.
Yeah.
That liveliness.
I'm over in Brooklyn, New York.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
Neighbors.
I know, right? Did y'all know that? Right on. Oh, we have. Okay. What about you, Terrence? Where you at?
I'm up in New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. So we got the Middle East. I mean, the Middle East, Lord. We got the East Coast well represented. No, so I saw Lebanon, right? My brain just. So some people were sharing where they're joining us from. We got Michigan, we got Massachusetts, we have Ohio. So we got some neighbors. Nobody from the West Coast. Sorry, Dr. Yip. Nobody's from the West Coast. They're probably still in the middle of their workday, right?
Yeah, it's only 3 o'clock here, so not exactly happy hour yet.
Yes. Well, as they say, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right?
Always.
All right, so we'll give everybody a few more minutes to join us. Panelists, get comfortable, get loose. We're about to engage in a lovely, nice conversation about representation. I am loving the way this panel looks. We are all looking just excited to be here. And if we take my energy, we're all just going to be ready to go. Isn't that right?
I love it.
Me too.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we're all going to ask for forgiveness for any technical difficulties beforehand. I was literally set up 15 minutes before, and then, of course, my computer started acting crazy. So if anything happens, just give us some grace. We're going to pull out the technical difficulties and get everything taken care of. Let's see who else we got here. Oh, Dr. Yip, looks like Carolyn is in. No, that's Garcia. They're in California. Who else we got? Anybody else? Tell us where y'all at. Tell us where y'all coming from. So only when I'm in Kentucky do you hear me say y'all this much. And I just noticed that. That was my own reflection. I was like reflecting on why I'm saying y'all a whole lot. All right. While we're waiting, I'll do the housekeeping things. Okay. So before we dig into our roundtable, I'd like to share a bit of information with our viewers and listeners. This live stream is intended to serve as educational content and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please be sure to work with your local provider or contact a local clinician. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline and should not be used if you are in distress or feel unsafe. If you are in crisis or you are ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or call the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255. We also want to create as safe a space as possible and be kind and respect everyone. With that, this is being broadcast on several social media platforms and is being recorded. So please be mindful of that as you ask personal questions or leave comments. At the end of the day, we're all here to support one another. So now that we have a number of you who have linked in with us, I want to welcome you to the IOCDF Diversity Roundtable. I am your moderator, Dr. Darlene Davis. In line with IOCDF's mission of fostering a hopeful and supportive community for those affected by OCD and the professionals who treat them, I would also add the family members and the loved ones of those affected by OCD. I welcome you to today's roundtable discussion on representation in the OCD community. We wanted to really have an opportunity with everything that's been going on in the world to create a space for us to have open dialogue. And again, as we talked about before, a safe space for us to share about what our community looks like as it relates to representation. If this is your first time attending a roundtable discussion, I will give you some context. A roundtable discussion is an organized conversation that uses a moderator, myself, to weave together all of the useful and vibrant information that will come from the invited panelists, those who you will be introduced to very soon. This is also a space for involvement from the audience. So please feel free to ask questions. I will be monitoring the comments section. If there's something that you want to add to the discussion, please feel free to do so. And we also want you to feel as involved and engaged with us. So we hope that this is an open, vibrant conversation, and we thank you for joining us this evening. So the goal for this roundtable is to move beyond traditional diversity discussions that center awareness. So what is awareness? We often go to diversity talks and they're telling us things about different groups, different populations. So they're sharing information with us. With our diversity roundtable, we hope to move that needle towards action. That's making change, that's being the change. And so in doing so, we will honor the following agreements. 1, we will hold a space where differing perspectives are respected. 2, we will model effective ways to have difficult dialogue around topics of diversity. And 3, we will take action steps towards enacting change. And with this solid foundation and our mission to foster a hopeful, supportive environment, and our agreements that center respect and modeling effective communication, I believe it's time to get into our discussion on the topic for today, which is representation in the IOCDF community. And to do so, I would like to switch over and center our panelists. And so I will follow how you all present on my screen, if that's okay, and ask you to introduce yourselves to our IOCDF community. And we will start with Henry.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Henry Willis. I'm a clinical psychologist from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and currently completing my clinical internship at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. And I've been studying OCD, specifically how it presents in African-American young adults for the past few years. And I have a specific interest and focus on looking at how race-related factors like racial discrimination and other forms of racism can make OCD worse for African-American youth and young adults.
Awesome. Welcome. And how long would you say you've been with the IOCDF community?
Yeah, great question. So I've been in the IOCDF community for, I would say, about the past 3 or 4 years. I actually was awarded the Young Investigator Award to study OCD in African-American young adults longitudinally from the IOCDF. So very grateful to be here.
Congratulations. And what would you say is a relevant piece of information about you that you believe adds to your perspective in this community?
Yeah. So I think one of the big pieces, I bring my own lived experiences as an African-American male, young adult, and 2, a lot of my community-based work in mental health and in reducing mental health disparities. I saw a lot of the barriers to mental health treatment, specifically, for people suffering, a racial ethnic minority group suffering from OCD.
Sure.
And so a lot of my lived experience in that really lays the foundation for my passion for really increasing diversity in OCD research and clinical work.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Henry.
No
Welcome.
problem.
I'm so excited that you're on this panel. Thank you for joining us. All right, Vinay, you're up next.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Vinay, he, him pronouns. I'm a community healthcare organizer. So I'm the national field organizer with the Center for Popular Democracy. And basically what that means is we're building power to try to improve and expand healthcare in America. So that includes like combating the overdose crisis, like lowering drug prices, improving mental health care, fighting for universal health care, stuff like that. And aside from that, I'm also like a freelance writer, and I spend a lot of time writing about mental health, several like essays and short fiction and stuff like that. You can catch that on my website, which I think Fran just dropped. And at the IOCDF, I'm part of the Diversity Advisory Council. I've been there for a couple of years now. And I do have some bad news for Henry. He went to UNC, I went to Duke for several years. So it's going to be a whole thing. I don't know. Well, I just want to put that out there. Full transparency before we start. Yeah.
Y'all are just becoming neighbors.
Yes.
I know, we were just so close so soon.
Vinay, we were building bonds, we were building bridges. All right, Vinay, and what would you say is the piece of relevant information or characteristic that you bring to your experience as being a part of the IOCDF community?
I'll say a few things. I'm an Indian American, and in our communities, we have all sorts of specific stigmas associated with mental illness that I'm sure we'll get into here. Also, as I mentioned, as an organizer, this thing is particularly relevant for this conversation because it's very action-oriented work. And also, in addition to OCD, I have depression, suicidal ideation, and those are things that people aren't always comfortable talking about. So I'm happy to normalize those discussions here.
So I hear not only access to care, but also lived experience and speaking specifically to topics that we don't normally like to bring up as often.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Vinay. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Dr. Yip, you're up next.
Okay, I'm Dr. Jenny Yip, and I am the director and founder of the Renewed Freedom Center in Los Angeles. I've been working with the OCD population for over 2 decades, and I've been involved with IOCDF for 2 decades. 2001 was the first conference I went to, so 2 decades. Wow, time's flown. And right now, I am on the board of directors at the International OCD Foundation, and I am also the co-chair of the Diversity Advisory Council. So I am thrilled to be here and having this talk with everyone here.
And we are very glad and grateful to have you here. What would you say, given your role and your 2 decades of experience in this community, what would you say is the characteristic or the trait that you believe your representation or your role offers to this community?
I would say that in observing the changes that's been made in the last 2 decades, there's definitely a much more focus and awareness about diversity issues. You know, when I came onto the scene 2 decades ago, there was no information about families, or there was very little information about pediatric OCD. And now we know that if you're going to treat the child, you're going to have to treat the family as well. And I'm hoping that with my presence and my work with the Diversity Advisory Council, we can also bring that change to people of all diverse backgrounds.
Yes.
Because as we know, I mean, OCD affects anyone and everyone. Yes. So that does not exclude anyone of any ethnic, racial background.
Absolutely. And I think that's the most relevant point about this particular roundtable. Because as I sat here and thought about kind of where we would go and how we would navigate this, in my experience being an IOCDF, being a researcher, being a clinician, I couldn't find any literature that says one group is more affected or more impacted than the other group. So that's why diversity becomes so important, because it is the different lenses in which we view and experience OCD that really impacts how it manifests, which then impacts how we treat it, which then affects what kind of supports the community needs. So that is an excellent point, Dr. Yip, and I look forward to hearing more about that through the rest of our dialogue today. Thank you very much. All right, Terrence, you're up.
I'm happy to be here. My name is Terrence Ching. I am a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at the University of Connecticut, and I'm wrapping up my final year internship at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center. That's why I'm here in New Hampshire. And I identify as a cisgender male, gay male of Singaporean Chinese descent. And I also identify as a family member of someone with OCD. OCD, I guess for that reason, has been my home base of clinical and research interest. And in recent years, I've been more interested in how the treatment of OCD can intersect with more innovative therapies, such as the use of psychedelic compounds to augment evidence-based therapies. We might be going too far in digression there, but I'll let you ask your question, Darlene.
So, Mr. Ching, what would you say, based on your experience having a family member, that representation, and then your work as a clinician and as a researcher, what do you think that adds to what role you play in contributing to the IOCDF community?
I think, because of my intersectional minoritized identities, so I'm an immigrant too. So coming from Singapore, where I was part of the majority race, and then becoming somehow suddenly part of a minoritized community here in the United States, represented like a very radical shift in my consciousness around the issue of identity as it intersects with, OCD in this case.
Mm-hmm.
So being a family member of someone with OCD, and also identifying as someone who has various minoritized identities here and now in this country, I kind of have a sense of what it means to be othered in that sense. So living with OCD certainly can be a very othering experience. I think I bring that level of empathy to the conversation here, and I really hope to dig into that with everyone here today.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that word, empathy, right? Because the whole purpose of this panel, this roundtable, is to create, again, the space where we can talk about all the different identities, the intersectionality of it, and again, connect it back to the lived experience of OCD. Whether it be you working with someone with OCD, whether you're creating opportunities for improvement and access to care, whether it's just speaking into the atmosphere, some of the experiences that are often overlooked. So again, thank you, Terrence, for sharing that with us. I will go last. I am Dr. Davis. I am a clinical psychologist and researcher. I did a lot of my work like Henry in young adults, specifically in Black folks. I identify as a cisgendered Black female who is a huge advocate for improving and removing barriers to care and increasing access to mental health evidence-based resources, right? Because for me, it's just not enough to give Black folks access to care. I want it to be stellar. I want it to be excellent. And in order to do that, from my perspective, what was important for me is to make sure that clinicians understood the experience. Because what we know and what we've seen across the board is that culture plays a huge role in how it manifests. So a lot of my publications, a lot of my research has been looking into what is the role of culture. So when we're looking at diversity, we're looking at family dynamics, we're looking at cultural, ethnic, racial experiences, we're looking at faith-based experiences, we're looking across the board. And so because of that, I appreciate all of the experiences you all bring to this panel, because you're going to speak to all of that in some way. And most importantly, because this is kind of our first one, and we just kind of want to anchor our community in what roundtable discussions can look like, I thought it would be really helpful for us to focus on what it means. And I want the panelists to chime in, what it means to consider representation in the IOCDF community. And are we getting it right? As an IOCDF community, are we getting it right? So I would like to offer to the viewers a helpful technique before we turn it over to the panelists. So as the panelists will be sharing a wealth of information and valuable perspectives, it might help to listen for maybe one or two new things from each panelist that you didn't know before. That'll help us really have a very fruitful dialogue, as well as make sure that the information that's being shared today you can really connect with. And if there's anything that you want more information on, or you feel will be helpful for us to dig into a little bit more, make sure you drop it in the comments. All right. So as I shared before, think of panelists. This is for you all. As we're thinking about IOCDF, and for me, my experience, I think for me, it's been about 10 years now. I've been in the IOCDF community, started off as a graduate student doing research, coming for the conference, then started doing more work with the actual folks who came in from the community. My experience with IOCDF was like, wow, this is a very diverse community. But let me explain how. Diverse community in the way of providers, in the way of clients, in the way of academics, because I had never gone to a conference where all these people are in the same space at once. So you have providers that are psychologists, social workers, counselors, you have clients, children, young adults, you have academics, researchers, graduate students. We're all in here gathered together in this conference. And then on top of that, you had all this information about coexisting disorders, right? You got BDD, you got hoarder, you got substance use. So I go back to you all, the original questions. Panelists, are we getting it right? Yes, no, yes and no. What do you think? We're
on our way to getting there, right? I mean, even if I'm thinking about the last 20 years, my observations, it was phenomenal being in a space where, like you said, there were so many people of different professional backgrounds and different reasons, and everyone is here at the same place. I think the only other conference that does this is probably the autism conferences. You know, they do that. And it was phenomenal. Now, I do have to say that 20 years ago, when you go to a conference, the majority of the people there are going to be white. That's just it. You know, and I recall there might be a few people of different ethnic backgrounds, but I felt like I was in a space where it was with a lot of white people. And I think if I'm looking at every single conference I go to now, and I can't wait till we can go back to in-person conferences.
Me too.
The number of like diverse people of different backgrounds, racial backgrounds, you know, and you know, it's just more. I am constantly wowed by seeing how many other different cultures we're able to attract to our conferences. You know, and to me, that feels good being an Asian American, because that to me means we're doing something right. We might not be there yet, but we are doing something right to attract so many people from so many diverse backgrounds. That doesn't mean the work is done. It certainly isn't. We still have a long way to go, but we're getting there. And every time I go to a conference and I'm seeing different, like more psychologists and psychiatrists and practitioners and, you know, researchers who are Asians or African Americans or, you know, Latins, I mean, it's just exciting. That means we're lowering the stigma with these other cultures. And that is one of the hugest barriers to treatment for people of different diverse backgrounds.
The huge barrier being representation. Is that what you're speaking of when you say?
Oh, I mean, there are so many barriers, right? Representation is just one of the many.
Yeah.
Then there's stigma.
Yeah.
Right. So if we see a clinician or a researcher of color, then we're able to bring down that stigma just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, good point, Dr. Yip. Anybody else want to add something to that?
I definitely agree that this probably will be a continual work in progress, because humanity is not like a stagnant state. It continues to evolve. Thus, for an organization that serves a specific purpose of betterment of overall mental health for a specific community, it needs to evolve as well. The thing that I'm kind of latching to in this moment is the I in IOCDF, the international in the name of the organization. I fondly remember, you know, I've been going to the conferences for like 5 to 6 years now. And in the first couple of years that I've attended the conference, I fondly remember just international researchers coming in to present their research. You know, I see folks from Japan, from Korea, and at that time, I still like really was in that transitional stage of, you know, being a fresh immigrant to the United States. Like, I feel some deep connection to, you know, Asia, and I still do. And it was just nice to see people that seemed familiar to me, that looked like me, that had, you know, the time and effort to invest in making that trip all the way over here from Asia to the United States to present a poster. So I thought, like, for an organization to be accountable to the I in their name, I think they certainly are putting in the work to make this as international as possible. So I think it goes back to the idea of representation to really live up to its name. I think continuing to increase international representation at all levels. I think we have a lot to learn from how people understand and treat OCD in other cultures besides the predominant one in North America.
And I would even add to that, I think one of the things, just to go along with what you all said, I have too witnessed the expansion of various ways that IOCDF has created space for various groups. And one of those areas is the Latinx population, right? So there's a whole built out space for the Latinx community. But that, for me, that space that continues to need more growth is for the Black American experience. I feel like that's the area that is still developing and still needs more development. And I think it's a very interesting and unique experience and perspective, even going along with what you said, Terrence, right? So we can go to the continent of Africa and learn about those various ways that they are treating various mental health disorders, except they may not map very nicely onto the Black American experience. And so for that reason, we have that international reality that exists, but there is still work on the North American continent that needs development around the Black American experience. So with that, if I'm thinking about kind of what you all have shared and what I'm thinking about representation, and as Dr. Gibbs said, representation and stigma seems to be a huge part of kind of where we're coming up and hitting these barriers. Why would you say representation of your respective role and identities are important in the IOCDF community? How does having your identity and your role represented in IOCDF adding to the IOCDF community and the future that we are talking about, where you're needing to continue to develop? Where do you all fit, or in your representation in your group?
I could jump in here if that's cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like for me growing up, there's just no one who looked like me, who talked about these things like in movies or television or classrooms, just like anywhere. So it took me like a very long time to realize I had OCD. I think my symptoms started when I was 13 and I wasn't diagnosed until I was 24. And I didn't find like meds that really kept me stable until a year ago. So that's like 19 years that I would love to have back. So I'm hoping like people who look like me, who maybe watch this or like read something I write or see something, there's more representation now, in all kinds of media. Maybe instead of 19 years, it could be like 2 years or 2 months or 2 weeks, before they actually get treatment. And like, what kind of transformational effect could that have on that person's life? So I feel like when people talk about stigma, they often talk about it in like an interpersonal, like kindness way. And of course that's important, but that's not all it is. It also like tangibly affects public health outcomes. It gets people to opt into treatment. It gets people to raise their hand in classrooms, tell their parents, tell their friends that they're struggling with something. So like what we're doing here can like actually transform people's lives. So as Indian American, that's important. And also talking about like suicidal ideation, that's not something people like to talk about. And then within my own type of OCD, I have harm OCD, which for people who are not familiar, it means I often obsess about violent scenarios involving my loved ones. And sometimes like I'm the danger. So growing up with those thoughts, it's like, it's very easy to think like you're monstrous, right? Especially like brown person growing up in New York post 9/11, like people who look like me are vilified and presented as dangerous in media all the time. Every time there's a mass shooting, we're presented as dangerous and like, oh, was the person mentally ill? Just like all those kind of factors kind of seep into your mind and affects like how you see yourself as being dangerous. And we know that's not true. We know we're not dangerous. People with OCD are like the most harmless people you're ever going to meet. So I just think speaking as an Indian American and speaking as someone with harm OCD, it's important to reach that kid out there who maybe sees this and is like, oh, that's what I have. Like, I guess I'm not, monstrous as I thought it was.
Yeah. Excellent point around representation and being able, especially in doing the work with young adults and younger people. It is so important. You've seen the little hashtags. You've seen, I think Netflix has a whole section now that's called Representation Matters. And that's because people are really picking up on the concept around this, that it's a lot of the connections that we make are through media. And you could say that's unfortunately or fortunately. And in your case, you're saying it's fortunately, right? Fortunately, there will be a child who looks like me, who will see me, who will hear me and will say, oh, I'm going through that exact same thing. I can go express this to someone and I have the words and I can point and say, that's it. That's the thing right there, right? That does become transformational. And if we're talking about removing barriers and increasing access, this becomes one of the most important things. This is it. This is how we do it. And so again, along the lines of with IOCDF, like moving into this virtual realm, moving into putting the faces up for people, moving towards lifting the voices of folks, not just saying, hey, this is out there, but hey, these are the people. Here are your experiences. You can see these experiences. You can hear these experiences from the mouths of those people who are living that life. That's super important. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to take a stab at that? Why is representation of your identity or your role important?
Yeah, for me, one of the biggest things as a Black American, like with that lived experience, is that, for me, it always feels like as an academic and as a researcher and a clinician, bringing the voice of my community and that experience into rooms where it often is missing. And so being able to, really highlight different disparities that face Black Americans in particular, or even different things that may make OCD worse or may make it harder to get OCD treatment, that, people from those communities may not actually be in those rooms to advocate for themselves. So for me, it's that kind of intersection between, really advocating for my own community and really trying to emphasize the importance of diversity as much as possible. And I also see that same role in just how we do research and thinking about how we look at culture beyond, just a binary variable. What that means is something like 1 equals Black, 2 equals white, and just really get into the nuances of what do we mean when we say culture? What are the exact experiences are we talking about? And how do these exact experiences not only impact OCD, but impact how clinicians treat OCD, impact how we measure it, impact how we, just so many different aspects of it. And two, as I think about that, long term, I think about representation and the importance of making diversity a core and shared value so that we can start to take the burden off of people of color and from marginalized communities to always be the ones to have to advocate for diversity and really make it a core value where we can start to say that we won't ever fully understand OCD and OCD treatments if everybody doesn't care about culture and how it impacts it in the same way.
That last part is powerful. Does anybody have any points or anything to add to that piece? Because I know for me that whole taking the weight off of the minoritized group or the marginalized group, I should say, or because we do as the minority, you see my air quotes, as a minority group, we're often the onus tends to fall on us to kind of bring to the attention some of the additional challenges that fall on us, or to correct or to address for the sake of, improving things. What do you guys say about that piece?
I want to go back to the treatment aspect, right? So like you were saying, Henry, about the representation, when we are treating individuals, if we are not considering the culture that they grew up in, the background, the values that they grew up in, it's really hard to treat a person with OCD without having that. So, I think that is hugely important when it comes to training clinicians, right? That we don't just go into training how to treat OCD. Well, how in the world are you going to treat OCD and the family when you have no idea about the culture and the values and the attitudes and belief systems and the practices that this person came from? And we certainly, one of the things when I train my interns is, you have to take into consideration the person's background, the person's family, the person's, attitudes and beliefs and so forth, right? Because otherwise, then what you're doing is you're putting your own values onto the person, and you're saying you have to, this family dynamic will only work according to the dominant culture's values, which isn't always how it works. And if you're going to take that attitude as a clinician to a family where they don't have the same belief system, then you've just failed as a clinician, because now you've just lost the family.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see that dynamic show up in how families and individuals persist in treatment, right? So you see a lot of folks leaving treatment early, and, research has been trying to really dig into that, but culture is a huge piece of that. And I imagine, Dr. Gift, that has a lot to do with it. Same for you, Henry. That has a lot to do with it. One of the biggest, strongest deterrents for seeking mental health treatment in the Black community is often feeling like you won't be understood, just feeling misunderstood. Nobody will get you. And then you add on top of that OCD. Oh my goodness, that's just, you're definitely, it comes with all of the stigma, but specifically around the way the OCD attacks our thoughts, attacks our identity, attacks self. It really serves as a barrier. We know that 8 years is about the average time that it takes for folks to show up for treatment. So the goal of this is to really, as you pointed out, Dr. Yip, address the training aspect, speak to the OCD community and say, we hear you, we see you, we know your experiences, we want you to show up for us. Speak to the trainees, speak to the researchers, speak to the providers. Hey, this is important, so that we can improve access, so that we can remove these barriers. Because sometimes the barrier has to do with financial, but other times it has to do with the connection with the clinician. And this cultural piece becomes a huge, huge, huge important part of it. And we know that OCD is very, very tricky, right? So if you leave anything unturned, like if you don't get into the values and the way things show up, it will be just kind of sitting over there in the head, just brewing all types of stuff. And the clinician's like, why is nothing changing? Well, it's because we're not digging in there, right? All right, so to that point about how the representation is important, what would you say, just based on you being in this community for the length of time you've been here, what would you say who would you say have the most well-represented voices, and whose voice would you say is missing currently from the IOCDF community? So who would you say is well-represented? And how has that benefited IOCDF community? And who would you say voice is missing? And how has that impacted the IOCDF community? Is that question clear? Because I realize I'm doing a double question.
I think so. So, I think it's mind-boggling to me that whenever I do a diversity training, or whenever I've presented on diversity issues, the Middle Eastern backgrounds are always missing. I have no idea why. When we're thinking about diversity, African Americans always there, Latin Americans always there, Asian Americans always there, especially now in the media, right? But Middle Easterns, somehow that group constantly gets left out. I have no idea why. I know that whenever I present on this topic, I make it a point to include someone who can speak on that and be able to represent this group, though I feel like, that's constantly left out.
I would have to agree with you there. Now that I'm thinking back on it, I think anybody else want to tackle that question? Who do you say is well represented and has benefited the IOCDF community? And whose voice would you say is missing? And how does that impact the IOCDF community?
I might have to agree with Dr. Ip in the sense that I can't, it seems like oftentimes discussions of the categories in which we classify people based on how they appear conspicuously always seems to correspond to census categories. And I think in that sense, it's because it's consistent with the narrative of race in this country, it becomes accepted as truth, when in fact there is so much diversity even within one of these categories, and that these categories are not in themselves comprehensive or exhaustive. So on that point, I think I do have to agree.
Here's another group, Native Americans. They're the first ones here. Yeah, I don't often hear much about that group when it comes to diversity and OCD or anything else, to be honest with you.
So we've definitely identified our more ethnic or cultural groups, things, as Terrence pointed out, how people conspicuously present themselves. Is there any groups that are less obvious? I know we talked a little bit about the families and the children, right? About how that's coming around. Is there any population that you think that while we're going in the right direction, is there a group that probably could benefit from more attention or their voices being raised?
Are you talking about ethnic groups? Are you talking about any group?
Yeah, any group. I feel like
Well,
we covered the ethnic racial groups for sure.
Right. Well, here's one that's dear and near to me: the perinatal population.
Good one. That's an
that is constantly missing. I mean, if you even look at the research on perinatal OCD, it's actually embarrassing.
It's very minimal.
We have none. And whatever research we have, I mean, the range of the statistics is everywhere.
Yeah.
So and talk about harm OCD, right? So imagine you're a new parent, mothers and fathers alike, and you're having these violent, horrific thoughts about your helpless little infant when you're supposed to be feeling love and bliss and joy and everything else. And then, of course, there isn't just a lack of awareness in the in the mental health community. There's a huge lack of awareness in the mental health and medical community. So if you're a new parent, you're exhausted as hell, and you go to someone to disclose these shameful thoughts, and then you get 5150. All of your fears have just been validated.
Yep.
I am a horrible person.
Yep.
Right? And that is what a lot of parents who are suffering with perinatal OCD go through. They either suffer in silence, because nobody else will understand, and if they hear you, they might, contain you.
Yep. That's what 5150 means. I imagine that's the hospitalization track. Is that what that is? Yeah, I figured.
That's a
so for
the
community, yes.
Right, 72
means
hour
you're
hold.
hospitalized. Right.
Mm-hmm.
To that point, going along with the types of OCDs that present. So one of the areas that I was trained in that I don't practice in as much at all, but sexual orientation OCD, as well as the pedophile OCD. I feel like those are areas or topics that people suffer with that were probably, or that group could probably benefit from having their voices raised, so that people can have an awareness, especially from to the same point that Vinay made about just having that represented, to be able to hear someone say, this is the experience, and if you're experiencing it, this is how you know. Like something like that will be super helpful, right? Because in the same way that Dr. Yip talked about, the child being potentially removed from the mother or her being hospitalized, the same exists for those folks, right? You could potentially lose your children, potentially lose your family, that whole dynamic with pedophilia OCD. So to that point, it will be beneficial for folks to have that kind of content. But I don't know if I said it out loud either, but I was thinking about the suicide OCD as well, where it's just constant, ongoing, intrusive thoughts of suicide and what that also could mean, and the severity of that, and not knowing where that falls as well from a clinical perspective. those are voices that just in my beef experience, in my training, that I thought could definitely benefit from more light being shed in that area. Me. Somebody else. Me.
Yeah, and being part of like clinical teams that offer the opportunity to collaborate on treatment for folks with these different, perhaps more highly stigmatized forms of OCD. Actually observing that they run into, their own share of trouble with, providers that misunderstand this kind of OCD, that there are serious, legal consequences, consequences in terms of being able to retain custody of your kid, of your child, should you tell your untrained provider that you have these obsessions. And I don't mean to speak for Vinay, but like just the intersection between some of these obsessions and having particular minoritized identities, it makes it even more salient that, I shouldn't tell anyone that I have these obsessions. I'm going to have to go off camera and turn something off. Sorry.
No, I can hop in there because I want to reflect on what Eric said in the chat. He said, being an African-American man with OCD can be difficult because exhibiting bizarre behavior in public can be dangerous in our society. And I think that's related here because like so much of America's approach to people with mental illness is policing and prisons and criminalization. And we know that doesn't work. And if you're existing in this country knowing that, and then you're having these thoughts of obsessing about hurting people or obsessing about pedophilia, OCD, that's an added incentive to never tell anyone about it. Like, I can't talk about this. I have to pretend I'm like harmless, pretend I'm, not a threat to anyone, especially in public, especially on the subway. I can't like be symptomatic. So that's a whole nother part of it. It's a whole nother reason to make sure people understand that you can have violent thoughts without being a violent person. You can have thoughts about, hurting a child, and that doesn't mean you want to do it. In fact, it means you're terrified of doing it, and it means you're never going to do it. So those are distinctions that like a police officer is not going to understand, right? Like, so you need to like be telling those stories in every way we can.
Absolutely.
I think, Vinay, you brought up a really good point. The idea of people who come into contact with people with OCD, I don't see them being represented at the conference, right? Like this could be a very worthwhile trip for the local police department to make to the conference, right? To learn more about the various presentations of mental illness for people that they serve in their community. So that could even be, an invitation for law enforcers or like other, paraprofessionals who serve people in times of a psychiatric crisis to understand what it means to navigate the OCD experience in a sensitive way.
And we know we see that movement happening a lot as a result of just the attention the police is getting now just from shootings of Black folks in general, but also in that conversation being added, because the first thing that often comes to light is whether or not that person has a mental illness, right? So a lot of times that has come up around the shootings of Black men. Well, this person was exhibiting bizarre behavior, and that's what resulted in them being shot. And so I like that idea of, inviting folks, right? That's a voice that needs to be lifted in the community. Sometimes they are not well trained. And so to be able to address that, that's a huge important piece. And that leads us to a conversation about the social context of all this, right? Because we're talking about diversity as if diversity exists in a bubble. It does not. It exists in a social context. And in this particular case, it's a social context of America. So we are Americans by the sheer nature of us living here. And so America has its own fabric, its own threading. Right. And so with that comes, again, the significance the importance of considering, as Dr. Yip has pointed out, and it often just resonates in my head, what exactly is the perspective of the client sitting in front of you? This is about validation. This is about information collecting. This is about, let's fully understand how this OCD exists, because this is their lived experience, right? So in that same breath, I ask you all, if we're taking this to a social context, and with this being, the state of action, because I'm all about action, I am well beyond awareness. I don't, as much as I know that there are so many more things I can learn, and I can learn that through my continued experience and growth and learning, I don't want to be stuck in awareness anymore. I want to move into action. So I've heard language like advocacy, things that pop up in my mind is activism. So if you had to panelists, if you had to think about what you might want to see in the future from a programming perspective, from an initiative perspective, from an action-oriented perspective, anything, what type of programming might you suggest that highlights growing representation for your role, your identity, or what you connect with, or a group that's important or are at the center of your heart? What would you suggest or recommend?
The first thing that comes to mind, I'm speaking from my identity as a family member of someone with OCD. It would be so nice to see support groups for families in which, one or more members have OCD. But these families are, people of your conspicuous identity, right? Like Asian families coming together, Black families coming together, Hispanic, Latina, or Latinx families coming together. Because, in my lived experiences with my family member with OCD, there have been numerous occasions where I think there's no way they can, enter treatment for OCD. Like they just don't think it's a thing. And I'm here getting a PhD doing exactly what, the type of treatment research that might be beneficial for them. But, there's a disconnect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I am supposed to be this emerging expert in this field, but I cannot even get my own family member to enter treatment for OCD. So what's the next best thing? So I think really promoting the idea of safe spaces, non-treatment oriented spaces, but rather a place where people can come together, shake loose some of that narrative that OCD equals schizophrenia or psychosis, that it is a serious mental illness always. Not to say that it can't be for people, but it's always dialed up to the extreme, especially for people who hold stigmatizing attitudes towards mental illness. So having that space for people to shake loose that stigma and open themselves up. And I have seen it in my own family member, like from the first time that I went to the IOCDF conference and they came with me to now, where they're more open about discussing their OCD. I think it's beautiful, this evolution. It took time, but it got there. And I think participating in the conference, even in a peripheral way, was some kind of a catalyst for that change.
Mm-hmm. And I like the first part is I like the consideration of the family member. But I one follow-up question I have is, why do you think it's beneficial to have it separated by ethnicity / race? Why do you think that, from your perspective, your experience?
Yeah. And that's the only perspective I can speak to is, like coming from an immigrant background, there is the sense that people who don't look like us don't necessarily understand the experiences we have. I think there is a sense of holding on to the possibility and sometimes the fact that we have unique experiences, unique lived experiences. And it would just be nice to be able to bypass that necessary, description to
Yeah.
someone who doesn't look like
Sure.
you. I think it's just nice to have that ease,
Yeah.
because already it can be challenging to come into this space to talk about OCD.
Yeah. And I wanted to hear you say that, because I guess for me it's understood, having that experience and living that experience and walking in a room and saying, okay, there are several of you in here who will get it without me having to say it. Like, that's the whole thing. And I wanted you to speak that out loud for those of us who are listening, because even if it's legitimate, my perspective is that that's what's going to happen. So again, going back to why representation matters, it just gives this comfort, this automatic comfort, whether it's real or not real. My perception is I am welcome. I am understood. I am accepted. And so having that is super important. So even if you have spaces where there's mixtures of different experiences, having that group experience in the way that you just described is just an added cushion. And I also like the non-treatment oriented piece of it, because I think from a clinician's perspective, from a researcher's perspective, I'm used to that, right? But from a family member's perspective, they don't care about all those words. They don't care. They don't care about the dimensions. They don't care about the surveys. They don't care about our findings. we get all nerded out by it, but they don't care. And so having a space like that that's just free of that is very beneficial and ideal. And I'm sure many people can speak to that. So thank you, Terrence. What about anybody else? Anybody want to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, so what Terrence just said and what you said about, Black families getting together, Indian American families getting together, Asian families getting together, I think that goes back to what Henry said earlier about how, like, the weight shouldn't be on us to, like, constantly be spreading awareness and educating. Because I think a common, like, misconception people have about, like, the goal of diversity is people think, oh, it's to get different people in a room with different points of view so we can all, like, understand each other. But that's not actually the point of diversity, right? Because if that were the point of diversity, then it would be to benefit white people, right? It would be for them to learn from us. But that's not why we're doing this. The point of diversity is justice, right? It's not just like awareness. It's justice. It's reparations. It's eliminating barriers to care. It's improving care. So if that means, like, a group of Black families getting together talking about mental illness, then that makes complete sense, right? It's not just about getting people with different points of view in a room. So just wanted to tie what Henry said to what Terrence said.
Absolutely. So if you took that and you wanted to, and you had an idea, you want to propose something that would connect with or provide support for your particular identities or your role, what would you think? What would be helpful?
I'm always, like, super action oriented because that's my job. So I would love, like, trainings on, how to speak to a legislator, how to, write an email to a legislator, how to do a lobby visit, how to talk to people at a town hall. And, like, I do those trainings all the time, and people will always tell me, like, well, I'm not, like, a lawyer or a policy expert. Like, why would I be in these meetings with, like, legislators, staffers? And I always tell them, like, you're an expert on your own story. Like, there's nothing I could possibly read in the book that would make me understand your story more than you do. And, like, that is the core of, like, all of those interactions. Like, we just bring constituents to their legislators over and over again with very specific stories and specific asks. And, like, that's how things get done. So, like, everyone listening to this has all they need to be an advocate, to be an organizer, and, like, we should, like, empower them and give them the tools to do it.
So if you had to break that down or make that connection for the general public, like, why would I want to do, or how would that be useful to me as someone with OCD or a family member with OCD or even a provider? How could that benefit me to be involved in that training?
Because I think, like, what we want is a world where we can all get good free care and stigma-free care, and, it's easy to access. And that's not going to happen with, like, interpersonal changes. Like, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It needs, like, systemic change, right? Like, systemic transformation. Mm-hmm. And the only way to do that is by people organizing and building power together and changing those systems. And, like, we're totally capable of doing that.
I think on top of that, Vinay, I think the conversation also needs to start earlier. So rather than just starting it now, why not educate kids in school about mental health, about diversity, right? We educate them about sex ed, right? Why not educate them about mental health, mental wellness, diversity issues, right? And if we are able to start this conversation early, and then it becomes normalized for them. It's not something that is unfamiliar. It's something that is okay to talk about. And if we're looking at the stats of how many of our youth today are suffering from mental illness, I mean, it's a huge amount. And many of them have no idea what to do with themselves because they have never had these conversations.
Yes.
And then parents, on top of that, don't know how to have these conversations.
Yes.
And then teachers are usually the first to recognize it. But when a teacher brings it up to a parent, then the school's liable. Right? So there's something wrong with that systemically. Yeah. Why is it that a teacher cannot bring this up with a parent without there being some sort of liability? And of course, different counties will have different regulations. But on a systemic level, that conversation just needs to be had much earlier.
Yeah, agreed. And I love how these are very tangible, action-oriented, focused, like tasks that can happen, and they're spanning across the lifespan, right? They're spanning across community areas, right? So we've gone from politics and legislation to community support groups for families, to the educational system and connecting with families and kids and educators. And I think you're on to something. I really do.
And Dr. Yip, you brought up a really great point. Not only just we need more education about mental health early on, but we really need more education about how to get mental health services. I can't tell you how many times people come to me because I'm a clinician and they ask me, like, how do I find a therapist? And I try to help people, but it's actually very, very hard when you have to factor in insurance and things like that. And even me as a clinician, a lot of times, like, I don't really know what to tell you other than like the basics. And so really not only finding ways to streamline access to mental health care, but really I would love to see programming around just helping people learn how to access mental health services in their community. And the second big thing that, I kept coming to and thinking about is, also really dismantling, racism and how it may perpetuate stigma in these marginalized communities in our different academic, research, and clinical structures. So how do we make sure that these different funding agencies and research structures are, making sure they're funding people that do research with these marginalized communities so we can better understand OCD in these communities? How, like Dr. Yip, you were saying, like, you really teach your trainees on how to incorporate culture and how they treat OCD. So how do we make sure clinicians across the country and the world also have that same value of teaching trainees so that, over time, we have this whole generation of clinicians and researchers that value culture versus just kind of, working on an individual basis? How do we attack it from a structural basis?
To the point of both accessing care, right? So you are absolutely right, Henry. It is very much a challenge to try and connect folks with mental health care. In my private practice, I've had to refer folks for various reasons. So that's the thing too, right? Having to refer people because they don't have insurance, or, I don't accept their insurance, or they can't afford care, right? That's one thing. But then going and trying to find someone who can meet your need, right? So we know that IOCDF does provide a guide for you to access OCD clinicians. The added piece to that is then what if we're looking to be connected by representation? How then do I know if this clinician is a clinician I can pair with, right? Because as Terrence pointed out, some things is just the automatic, just the thought, right? My perspective is there are certain things I don't want to have to explain. So I want to be able to go right to the source, and I want to get right into therapy, and I don't want to have to deal with the other piece of it, right? Because we do know, again, that everything that we're doing is within a social context. And so everything that each of you has shared all folds within a social context. And I really like and actually love the suggestions and hope that we can capture these and start to build these things out. The idea of preparing through the force of advocacy, right? And that can even from the advocacy on that level can even trickle down to advocacy for parents, right? How to advocate for your kids in a school setting. This is not about liability. This is about care. How to gain access for mothers, right, who are going through different dynamics. How to grant access to family members who are going through different dynamics, right? How do you find someone or access services that really tap into the nuanced layer of being Black in America, where you're dealing with racial stress and trauma and your OCD, right? Like all of these dynamics are important. And all of these we have tried to cover in this mere hour as if, you know, we're like gods out here. So I would like to say that you all have done an amazing job with sharing your experiences, with wanting to use this platform to really connect with the community. And I hope the community has found value and you tapped into my recommendation of trying to find one thing that the presenters or the panelists shared that was new to you. I know that I have captured a number of things that I was unaware of. So I thank you all for that. So if we're going to think about a tidbit, one thing you want to leave with the IOCDF community from your experience, including your websites and your social media hashtags and handles, I want to take you all back through and ask you to share one thing that you feel is of value. One thing that you would like to leave with the community about your work, about what you've shared, because it's always helpful to have just like a closing thought. So as we're going around, go ahead. Who would like to go first? If not, I'm going to tag you in. I'll give you a minute to breathe. Take it all in. Wow.
Uh-oh. She's going to give us more than a minute.
Looks like it.
Well, I'll go. I think it's important for everyone to understand that OCD is not what you assume it to be. Just because you think you know what OCD is, doesn't mean you actually know what it is. So as I, teach my interns to be humble about racial differences and so forth, to be humble about OCD as well. And don't just jump to conclusion that you know that OCD is just about washing or checking or what you see in the media.
I like that, Dr. Gibb. One of the things that's super helpful that I've learned, on the other side of my training is that consult should be a thing that everybody uses. Like if you tell your trainees nothing else, that's what you tell them. Consult. So if you don't know, there was a mention from a viewer who said, as a white provider, I strive to want to provide the services for my BIPOC clients. Absolutely. I appreciate that. You're the person I want to work with. The reality is there's no way I'm going to know everything about everybody. And the expectation is not that you do, but please, for the sake of those out in the community, feel free to consult. Consult. Henry and I, we work with the Black folks. Consult. Terrence, Asian community, specifically Singaporean. Consult. We're out here. So consult. And it doesn't have to be racial, ethnic. You have an adolescent, you have a young adult, consult. Consultation is the way to go. That's what I would say to that. All right, Henry, you're up next. I'm going to go around that way.
Yeah. Yep, sounds good. I think for me, the thing that comes to mind that I would love to leave folks with is the word resilience. We didn't talk a lot about this, but a lot of my work also not only looks at the risk factors, but also the resilience. So when we're thinking about OCD in these marginalized communities, thinking about what are the factors that are natural to these communities? Is it social support? Is it religion? Is it some kind of other practice that they've been able to cope with their symptoms and with their mental health? And how can that be infused into treatment to kind of really help recovery? So that'll be what I leave folks with.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. Vinay, you're up next.
Sure. I'll leave folks with two things. First, I just want to validate how difficult all this is, for everyone on this call, living with a mental illness, especially this last year and a half during this COVID era, especially looking at the news every day and just seeing endless horrors everywhere. Just validating how hard this is, especially when you're a person of color in this country because of all the things we talked about. So just want to say, everyone here, I'm here with you. I feel you. We see you. So thank you for being here. And then I guess one word I would leave you all with is power and agency, because as I described earlier, all the the way change happens is it's people like you out there, like building power. And like, we look at the world and there's just so many horrors right now, but it doesn't have to be that way. And like, we're the ones who can change it. So I hope people feel like agency and power.
Awesome. Thank you, Vinay. And lastly, Terrence, what should you leave with the people?
The thought I want to leave folks with is, as I shared my experience of my family member attending the conference and then that evolution, is holding out hope for the possibility that healing can take more than one form and it need not be in an individual therapy setting in a closed space with a therapist. That healing can take many other forms in ways that we haven't imagined before.
Wow. That's a nice one to go out on, because I think it's important for the larger community to hear that hope and healing is a huge part of this. We hang on to hope, and we hope that the healing comes from that. And so that is a very powerful phrase. And so with that, with those words of wisdom from our wonderful panelists, I first want to thank you all for showing up and hanging out with me. Hope I did you all justice. It was my honor to be here with you all and engage in this conversation. For the larger community, we want to thank you for showing up. I'll leave a couple call to actions with you all. One, the first being community collections. I would love to hear from you all. We would, as the Diversity Roundtable, would love to hear from you. Lift your voice, share your story. I hope that these stories that were shared on a panel today really resonated, so that, you know, you felt heard, you felt seen, you felt validated. And my goal and my hope is that that brings you out and brings you forward, so that you can then engage in the way that Vinay talked about, and lifting your voice, feeling empowered, advocating for yourself. So bring those stories our way. I'm calling those community collections. Those are collections of stories and experiences that I would love to share on this platform. The other call to action is ideas for inclusivity. Okay, so we talked a lot about representation. We know there's continued work that needs to be done. We're obviously here at this table to continue that work and moving that forward. So we're open to receiving suggestions, recommendations. Tell us your thoughts. That's what we're here for. And then the last thing we'll ask you to do is show up to our next Diversity Roundtable. That'll be Tuesday, July 20th at 6 p.m., where our goal is to talk about creating safe spaces. So again, we welcome all the feedback, all the information. Share with us how you thought this went. Share with us any feedback. We would love to hear about, you know, if there's something else you want to discuss. This platform is open for you as much as it is for us. So thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Panelists, hang around. We're going to close out. We thank you all for joining us tonight. Look forward to seeing you all in a couple months. Have a good night. Thank you very much.